EU nations have formally adopted an unprecedented set of sanctions against Tehran, which include a bloc-wide embargo on Iranian oil. The move targets Iran's nuclear program, which the Islamic Republic insists is for purely peaceful purposes. Let's get more details on the latest development now from our correspondent Tessa Arcilia, live in Brussels. Tessa, these fresh sanctions, exactly what measures do they involve?
Well, yes, they have formally and officially adopted these unprecedented sanctions on Iran. It's essentially a total oil embargo. It will have immediate effect on new contracts, but then existing contracts will be allowed to run for another 6 months. They've also agreed on a ban on gold and gold trade and other precious metals with the Iranian central bank. All of these, of course, aiming to financially and economically cripple Iran over its controversial nuclear program, with Western leaders still insisting Iran is trying to build nuclear weapons, while Tehran denies this. Now, the EU embargo follows strict new U.S. sanctions that were passed into law by President Obama in January. So as far as the EU is concerned, by July, it will be a full and total implementation of these new sanctions.
Well, Tessa, when you talk about the implementation, of these new sanctions and the idea of crippling the Iranian economy, it's surely blocking off Iranian oil to the entire EU bloc. It's not just going to hurt Iran, is it?
Well, certainly, this is unprecedented in terms of the scope and the desired potential effects on Iran, but it is also unprecedented in terms of its potential economic impact on the European Union itself. Let's not forget, the EU it imports up to 20% of Iranian oil. It's the second biggest buyer, and among the 27, the biggest buyers within that are Italy, Spain, and Greece, the very same countries that are now struggling to deal with a sovereign debt crisis. Greece, in particular, heavily dependent on Iranian oil, with up to 1/3 of its total imports from Iran. Also, it's relying on Tehran for easier credit terms, so they will definitely have to find alternatives for these countries. These are what the leaders will have to talk about, how to cushion the potential economic impacts on several member states. Now, there's also the question on the effectiveness of these sanctions, because there is still China, which up to this point has not agreed on to go on board with the U.S. and EU-led sanctions on Iran. It is still the largest buyer of Iranian oil, and if the EU and the U.S. don't want it, possibly China will just step in and buy the oil that the others don't want. So there's a question of whether these will actually work. And of course, because of all the uncertainty, oil markets have already reacted, pushing oil prices up, and higher oil prices will just mean higher prices of goods. And there's also, of course, that escalating tension at the Strait of Hormuz. Iran had said it has every right to block the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of the world's oil tankers pass through, and it will definitely impact global trade on that. Iran said they will likely do it in retaliation for the sanctions. There are already U.S. carriers monitoring the issue there. Definitely possibility of escalating conflict.
Indeed, Tessa. It seems almost every day we see a movement in escalation between the West and Iran over its nuclear program and the ongoing oil issues as well. RT's correspondent Tessa Arcilia in Brussels. Thank you. Well, to discuss the implications of fresh sanctions against Iran, let's now talk to James Corbett, editor of the independent news website The Corbett Report, based in Japan. Thanks for coming on RT today. Do you think this new round of sanctions will achieve anything when it comes to resolving the nuclear program crisis in Iran?
Well, that's assuming that there is a crisis to be resolved. It's interesting to see what will happen here, because, as has been noted, this is likely to affect Europe at least as much as it will affect Iran, if not more so. And certainly in the current energy climate, I think it will be easier for Iran to replace its European exports with exports to other countries than it will be for Europe to find imports from other sources. But certainly we do see that this will have a crippling effect on some of the European economies themselves, as has been noted. Roughly 1/3 of Europe's one-third of Iran's exports of crude oil actually go to Europe at this point, and a full 80% of that export demand in Europe is taken up by 4 countries: Turkey, Italy, Greece, and Spain. 3 of which are part of the so-called PIGS countries that are already teetering on the edge of economic collapse. So it's very interesting to see this move that is likely to hurt Europe, as I say, at least as much as it hurts Iran.
Now, regarding, let's step aside from the energy issues here. Let's talk about that of saber rattling. Iranian media says the country's senior official has already said that Tehran could definitely close the vital oil transit route in the Strait of Hormuz because of the oil embargo. Today, we're seeing stories: another American warship, a French warship, a British naval destroyer, all of them now heading into the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran goes ahead with the threat to shut down the waterway, what's next?
If it were to go ahead with that threat, I think the military, some sort of military strike would have to be in order. That would be too much of a provocation to go unnoticed. But for that very reason, I find it extremely unlikely that Iran is actually going to start the hostilities in that manner. I think it's far more likely that they would use that if military intervention had already started in Iran, or if the sanctions had become economically unsupportable. But I find it very difficult to believe that Iran will actually use that sort of nuclear option, so to speak. I realize they have been certainly escalating things in terms of the saber rattling recently, but I think that's really more of a putting their card on the table to try to stave off any sort of military intervention or some of these sanctions.
Now, in the past 2 years, Iran has allowed the IAEA into its country for a number of different investigations into so-called nuclear plants. It's also signed 3 anti-nuclear agreements over the past 12 months. With these these ultimately Western warships going into the Strait of Hormuz, are we seeing just a basic game of political chess, or even a provocation here?
Well, I think there's no doubt there is some provocation and some testing of the waters, quite literally and figuratively, going on right now. And certainly with Iran's recent threats to block the Strait of Hormuz, now we see the Americans sending ships through there to sort of test the defenses, so to speak. So I think there is definitely some cat and mouse going on right now. And I think at this point it is saber rattling and testing, both sides testing to see how far the other is going to go. And as I say, at this point, I would be extremely shocked to see Iran actually pulling out the option of mining or otherwise blockading the Strait of Hormuz, because that seems to me that's pretty much the last card up their sleeve. So I don't think they'd want to put it on the table too early.
And very briefly here, we're running very low on time. I apologize for that. Finally, if the new sanctions fail to work again, could we be back to the older stalemate position? What's the way out of that?
Well, oddly enough, I think the further that Iran is pushed into a corner here, the more their position will strengthen over time as they develop alternative routes out for their oil exports. If they, for example, increase their trading partnership with China or Russia and India, as we've seen in recent days, they've been scrambling to establish exchanges in other currencies, including their local currencies, including even asking India to trade in Japanese yen. So we could see really a fundamental shift in the entire dynamic of this energy export economy that's taking place right now, and it could actually serve to benefit Iran in the long run from getting them off of their dependence on the petrodollar.
James Corbett of the news website The Corbett Report, live from Osaka. Thank you.